Throughout the Second World War, there were a number of women who were on the wrong side of history, being evil guards inside of concentration camps. But there were many other women who fought for their country and their beliefs, taking up arms and bringing the fight to some of the most evil regimes the world has ever seen. The partisan resistance fighters, for example, used women to carry out sabotage and other operations, and in France the resistance used women in the same capacities as men. There were also female spies who were trained by British Special Operations Executive. They were parachuted and dropped off behind enemy lines to conduct espionage and to help coordinate resistance activity. But a number of these women, if caught, were subjected to brutal torture and they were then executed. The Merlinettes were a collection of women who worked in the Women's Signal Corps of the French Army during the Second World War. They were involved in most campaigns during the liberation of France, but for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, they despised the fact that women were involved in the armies of their enemies. They believed it was no place for a woman to be fighting in a conflict, and they often dealt with these brutally when captured, with women being immediately executed. But today we look at the execution of 4 of the Merlinettes, who were parachuted into France, and they were then sent to Ravensbruck Concentration Camp following their capture, where they were then executed. Join us today as we look at the execution of the female spies of Ravensbruck, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Merlinettes were made up of around 1,095 women by April 1944, who served in the Women's Signal Corps, and towards the end of the conflict, around 2,000 were involved. They are today believed to have been the first female soldiers of the French Army, and the Women's Signal Corps was founded and formed in November 1942. It was proposed to use women inside of the communications service, but before, women had been banned by law to serve in the army, and they were not allowed to. But attitudes did change, and they were then seen as a valuable wartime group. But the CFT, as it was known, was teamed up and was set up with the 1st French Army, and they were trained heavily. They would work as telephone operators, radio operators, signal analysts and messengers. However, the fight against the Nazis in the German army in France did not go very well, as the Germans rampaged throughout the country, and they then occupied the land, plunging millions into living under German rule. They also forced the Allies back to Dunkirk, but there were many efforts to continue the fight. But the Free French forces were continuing to fight inside of France. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the forces, appealed to the French to continue the fight against the Nazis and to oppose occupation and resist. They were opposed to an armistice, and to begin with, the Free French army did not have many men. Very few French believed that Britain could stand alone against the Germans, but the French would fight to defend the colonies they had possession of also. In 1944, the Merlinettes became part of the Free French forces, and this would be a very important year for the French. The invasion of Normandy would come on D-Day, and the Allies would break out of the bocage and would liberate a number of towns. Fierce fighting would take place, and then 500,000 strong French forces would fight alongside the Allies for the capture of their towns and villages. The women played an important role in this, seeing action in all the Free French campaigns, including in Italy. They landed as part of the French Expeditionary Corps with the Allied landings of Operation Dragoon, after the Allied advance from Paris to the Rhine. But within the detachment of women were a number of special forces who were sent to London to train further as commandos with Special Operations Executive. These women were to conduct sabotage and other acts of espionage, and these were given specialist training to do this. Despite 30 being trained, 11 Merlinettes were then sent on missions. But 4 of these would be captured. They were then sent to Ravensbruck Concentration Camp, where they experienced a brutal death. A call went out for recruits to be involved in these missions, and Suzanne, Mertzizen, Eugenie Djendi, Marie-Louise Cloarec and Pierrette Louin all volunteered. These women all came from different walks of life, and they had the same belief and drive to free France from the evils of the Nazis. When they arrived in London, these 4 were given further training in the capital as radio operatives to give them even more skills. Then they were sent to St Albans and Manchester for further training, which included how to handle and build explosives, how to fight when unarmed, and also how to parachute safely out of an aircraft to prepare them for their mission. It wouldn't be long before they were placed on the mission, and the 4 women all parachuted into France months before D-Day on the 6th of April 1944. They were sent to the Limoges region of France, and then the women would try to get to Paris to then stay and link up with a cousin of Pierrette Louin. However, within a few weeks of their landing in France, things would go wrong. The Gestapo had been tipped off to the location of the 4 women, and they were quickly arrested and were rounded up, being interrogated heavily by the Gestapo. Female spies were treated brutally by the German army after capture, and they were often tortured horrifically and condemned to death for their crimes, as they were seen as very dangerous. But following their interrogation, the 4 Merlinettes were then sent to Ravensbruck Concentration Camp. This was an all-female concentration camp, and around 132,000 women were imprisoned there during the conflict. Many came from different countries, including even Britain and America, and there were around 8,000 women from France who were held inside of the camp. Ravensbrück was opened in May 1939, and as soon as the gates opened, the women were being sent there. It's believed that 50,000 women died at the camp from disease, overwork and starvation, along with at least 2,200 women who were killed inside of the gas chambers. Ravensbrück was a site where many female spies were held inside, and many were brutally executed for their work against the Nazis. Life at the camp was very difficult, and when some arrived they had their heads shaved, but within years of the camp becoming overcrowded, the conditions there deteriorated heavily. One former inmate of Ravensbrück stated that, "They didn't shoot the women. We were to die of misery, hunger and exhaustion. When we arrived at Ravensbrück it was the worst. The first thing I saw was a cart with all the dead piled on it, their arms and legs hanging out, and mouths and eyes wide open. They reduced us to nothing. We didn't even feel like we had the value of cattle. You worked and you died." There were a number of sick medical experiments that took place there, and all inmates were forced to conduct heavy labour, which was very difficult. Some women were even forced to build parts of the V2 rocket, and many of them were forced to help build these destructive weapons that caused slaughter and death. As mentioned, there was a gas chamber, which was established on the site towards the end of the Second World War. A small hut near the crematorium inside the camp was transformed into becoming a gas chamber, and it was clear that the SS wanted to drive as many women in there as they could over the following months. Several thousands of women would be killed inside the gas chamber before the camp was liberated, and then following the deaths, their remains would be burned inside the crematoria next door. But by January 1945, before the camp's survivors were liberated, it was believed that there were 45,000 women prisoners at the camp. But as the Soviet Red Army were approaching, the order for the SS was given to evacuate as many as they could, and to not let any prisoner fall into the hands of the enemy alive. Huge death marches would take place, but for the women, who were considered spies, they would not be evacuated. The 4 Merlinettes, who had been in Ravensbrück for some time, were forced to conduct heavy work each day, but as the order to the SS was given to evacuate the camp and to prepare for the advancing Red Army, the order was also given to deal with the 4 French women. The women, as they were considered spies and members of the military, were sentenced to death, and they were to be executed also inside of Ravensbrück. The women, when they were captured, had asked to be transferred to a prisoner of war camp, as they were members of the military, but this was denied, and instead they were taken to a makeshift firing range at Ravensbrück on the 18th of January 1945. There was a group of SS men who had been gathered in the firing range, and then one by one the women were led out, and they were executed rapidly by the men with their rifles. Each of the Merlinettes were killed in the same way, and their bodies were then taken from the range to the crematorium, where they were immediately burned, and the SS did this in the hope that their stories would be forgotten, and that they would be erased from history. They then buried anything that remained of the women inside a nearby forest. But these women were then awarded a number of medals following the war for their service, and despite the fact their work as spies was not the most successful, they wanted to fight the Germans and wanted to help free France from occupation. But inside one of the worst concentration camps, they were all executed in brutal manner. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.